Hello, this is Jim Turner, Executive Vice President of Business Development for Frontline Managed Services. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar of Protect Your Data. This is a joint webinar with Frontline Managed Services and our strategic partner, Datto. Joining us today is Mike DePalma, and Mike is the Senior Channel Development Manager at Datto. And Mike, I think you and I have probably been working together for 6 years. Does that sound about right?
Sounds about right. We have traveled the globe together, Jim, so it's been a great partnership.
Okay, well, Mike, I really appreciate you taking the time to join us to help educate our partners, our clients, our friends about Datto and how Datto can be used to help to protect the data in the firms that we work with.
Yeah, and thanks,
you know what?
Jim.
I'm sorry, Mike, let me get some quick housekeeping. I did want to let our attendees know that this webinar will be recorded and we will distribute a link to the webinar after it's been completed. And also, should you have any questions during the webinar, please submit them either in the chat or in the questions, and we'll try to get to them during the presentation. And if we're unable to get to all of them, we will follow up with anybody who has a question for Mike or me or anything at all regarding the webinar. And over to you, Mike.
All right, perfect. Appreciate it, Jim. So my name is Mike DePalma. I am the, as Jim mentioned, Senior Channel Development Manager for North America here at Datto. We're not going to get too much into product or anything like that. I just want to kind of set the stage as to what we do. So we are a business continuity disaster recovery provider based up in Norwalk, Connecticut, so about 40 miles east of Manhattan. And my role really is only to do these presentations, these educational presentations, seminars, panel discussions. As Jim had mentioned, we've done a lot together. And recently I've been fortunate enough to do a few with some folks from the FBI, Department of Homeland Security, the CISA, some state agencies. And so as we go through some of the threats that are out there in the cybersecurity space, and then some of the ways to combat those, that's not just coming from the direct IT industry, that's coming from the government as well. So some of the things that we're going to cover, we'll go into that kind of a brief overview of where we're at, that kind of where that level is right now and how it's kind of bubbling up, some of those key threats, and not just necessarily threats in terms of the individual variants of viruses that are going there, but what those threats really mean to your firm. We've got some internal stats that we've done, and there's a lot of great third-party statistics out there, but because we're in the world of disaster recovery and business continuity, we want our own data. And so we've pulled thousands of business owners and managed service providers across the world to get some of those data. It's one of the largest it's only one of the largest ransomware specific reports that is in the industry right now. We'll talk a little bit about business continuity, about the communication that needs to occur, and then what it means to have kind of that hybrid, all-inclusive approach and multi-layered approach to these things. Now, as Jim probably knows, I'm a little bit of a history nerd. Normally I'm on the road 3-4 days a week, and so I spend a lot of time on airplanes and in hotels. And so I read a lot of books. People make fun of me because that's what I do. But I think it applies here because I like to put things into historical context of where we are right now. Because as you look through the course of history, there have always been these eras, these moments in time where there was some form of technological advancement, right, that propelled us forward, whether it was the Stone Age, the Bronze Age, the Industrial Revolution. And when historians look back at where we are right now, clearly we're in the digital revolution age, right? And thank goodness we're in this age. The cliche term is that technology accelerated 10 years in a matter of 10 months last year out of necessity, and that's great. The problem is at every one of these stages, there have been bad actors on the other side exploiting these same technologies, and we're seeing that right now. And so it's this constant kind of battle between the good guys and the bad guys to see, how we can protect our data. And I think the reason why that's important is that when you think of security and securing your firm, it's not a commodity that you go buy off the shelf. It's not, hey, I made an investment in security 2 years ago, I'm all set. It really is a living and breathing kind of part of what your business needs to be thinking about. And looking at it as a holistic approach is critical. And I know it sounds kind of wishy-washy a little bit when people say, that your employees are your first line of defense, but nothing is more true than that. And to really come up with a comprehensive cyber resiliency plan. And what I mean by cyber resiliency is, there's a lot of great technologies to prevent these attacks from getting through. New technologies coming out every day that are really, really good. But if you saw the FBI director stand on the floor of Congress about a month ago when he was getting grilled about the attack on the US government, he was very open in saying that there is nobody who can say that they are 100% secure. So cyber resiliency really takes that to the next level, meaning, we're going to do everything we can to prevent every attack. But if you are attacked, how quickly is that attack detected? And then more importantly, how resilient is your firm to get back up and running and having access to everything that you need? And so it really does start with the people, getting the complete buy-in and creating that culture of security. Then the process is critical as well. Who do you call? What are those next steps? This all needs to be documented. And then the technology comes into play. And I really think if any one of these three pillars are not met, you really can't say you have a full-fledged cyber resiliency plan. So at the end of all of this is why we keep it educational, and that's why it's being recorded, is that you really should be sharing these stories and these threats with the entire organization, because these criminals will find the weakest link. That's why they're so successful. That's why it's a multi-billion-dollar a year industry. And a lot of the stories that make the news, where obviously we talked about the coastline, the pipeline attack that happened a couple weeks ago, but you'll see the city of Baltimore, city of Atlanta, city of New Orleans, some of the large hospitals. I don't know if you saw earlier this week, there was an insurance company that reportedly paid $40 million in ransom, which is the largest payment that we know of that's ever occurred. That kind of gives a little bit of a false sense of security of everybody who's not in those high profile industries or municipalities, because the idea is two things. One, they're not going to attack me. Why would they attack me when they can go after these big fish? Or you throw your hands up and say, look, the FBI Director Ray said nobody's going to be secure. What chance do I have? And there really are kind of two groups. There's the large home run hitters that go after these large organizations that almost have a little bit of a different goal. And yes, that pipeline did wind up paying $5 million in ransom. But what they really liked about it was the notoriety, those hackers, that they're basically showing that we can get in anywhere we want. Those are the home run hitters. But the vast majority of the criminals out there are what I would refer to as singles hitters. They're just going after thousands of businesses at that next layer, that next level, knowing that they're going to have a higher success rate of getting through, but more importantly, a higher success rate of getting paid. Now, the reason why I like some of the large stories is because we get hard numbers. It's not theoretical studies that were done. We know that the city of Baltimore was asked for $75,000 in Bitcoin. Of all reports have shown they did not pay that. They have a very robust IT team, so they can go and they can get all that data back. It wasn't necessarily the risk of not getting the data back. It was the length of time it took them to do that. And at the end of the day, this attack actually cost the city of Baltimore about $18 million. This is the math that every criminal wants you to do. Pay this $30,000 in ransom, or go ahead and be down for a week or more and tell me how much that cost your firm. This is the math that they want you to do. And the government has always stated publicly that you shouldn't pay the ransom. But they finally put out an official statement back in October specific to ransomware. And within this statement, they talked about how the paying the ransom actually can put you in violation of breaking the law. And the reason for that is a lot of times the folks behind these attacks, they're terrorist organizations. They are enemy nation states. And so by paying that ransom, you can inadvertently be funding these organizations, which clearly is a violation of the law. Paying ransom, by the way, is not against the law. It's just a matter of where that goes to. Now, this doesn't have a ton of teeth right now because they don't really have a way of tracking this data, again, this money, because again, it's almost always asked for in Bitcoin. But it shows you the direction that the government is clearly going. They are now not just saying it anecdotally, they are coming out with official statements telling everyone not to pay the ransom. And so, when you look at the city of Baltimore, they went and they remediated that problem. And what happened a year later? They were attacked again. This time it was their school system. Shows you two things. One, that their IT department did a great job of eventually getting their systems back up online, but they didn't put any sort of protection in place to try to make sure that occurred again. And so they were attacked. But it also shows you what these criminals are all about. They're gonna, once they hit you once and they know they can get through, or more importantly, they know that you can pay, you're gonna have that bigger bullseye on your back, and they're gonna go and attack you again. And the reason why this is a successful story for them is that, hey, we showed you we can get in once, we can get in again. And even though they're not going to get paid out from this attack, they are scaring the business community to know we can get in wherever we want. And it's a scary proposition. So I think it's important to understand those threat groups before we get into this, because you have to really know who you're up against. When we saw the pipeline attack and there were all these stories coming about the actual attackers themselves, it seemed like new news that, hey, this is actually a corporate structure to some extent. There are the developers, the really smart guys who create these actual variants. But then there's that next layer of what I would term salespeople that go out and do these attacks. There are actually what we would call ransomware as a service kind of groups, where you go to the dark web and you can almost become a little franchisee on your own and go and buy these variants and go do as many of these attacks as possible. There's even another layer that we have seen, which is actually tech support. They'll pop on and say, hey, you don't have a Bitcoin account? We'll walk you right through that. When that news came out, it seemed surprising. This is what's been in our conversations for the last 5 years. This is how it's been done, and this is how they've been able to scale at the rate they've gone to. Now, we do see some insider threats. A lot of times this is where, you'll see very large industries with big proprietary information, but with the chaos of last year, we actually did see an uptick in those kind of malicious insider threats as well. Still makes up a smaller portion. You don't think about organized crime as being one of these threat groups, right? You think of the Sopranos, you think of the, Goodfellas and all the rest. This is where organized crime has shifted to, because anywhere that there's a lot of money to be made with little risk of getting caught, organized crime here in the States, Russia, China, Europe, they're going to follow that money, and they have their hands in this, and they know how to exploit that. I mentioned those nation states. We could put all the sanctions in the world on these groups. They're going to find ways to make money, and this is one of their prime ways of doing that. One of the webinars I did recently with a gentleman from the FBI down in Houston, he was the lead investigator on the Sony hack. Very interesting. He told me a lot of stuff offline that he didn't mention in the presentation, but really interesting stuff. But again, that was more of, I want to show you that I can get in and I can disrupt you, as opposed to getting money. That still is something that we need to be worried about. And then an interesting story, the Internet of Things, everything's connected. First thing I do in the morning is ask Alexa, what the weather's going to be. You can Google this one. I'll give you a little homework assignment. Actually, the most lucrative casino heist ever pulled was a few years back on a casino out in Vegas. And the way they were able to get through wasn't the way you see it in the movies, right? Guys sneaking through elevator shafts and all the rest. They were able to find a vulnerability in the internet-connected fish tank thermometer, those big fancy fish tanks you see when you walk in. And they were able to infiltrate that network and then extract all the financial and personal data from all the high rollers at that casino. Information that's worth millions of dollars in the dark web. It just shows you that, when you're thinking about your data and you think about protection, think about all the different ways that folks have access to that data and make sure that they're protected. Now, I mentioned that state of the channel ransomware report that we do. We've done it now 5 years in a row. And what we've seen is really, it ebbs and flows in terms of what industries are specifically attacked more. We saw an increase last year in healthcare. Clearly, there's a lot of pressure on the healthcare industry. But what's interesting is it shows you that every single vertical is susceptible for this. We see the legal vertical being attacked at a very high rate, and that has been there every single year. But it shows you that they can cast this huge net now. It doesn't matter what industry you're in, the size of your firm, they know that nobody could operate without access to their data. And so it allows them to be the home run hitters or the singles hitters to go out and attack everybody that they want to do. I had to do a continuing education webinar a few weeks back for some attorneys up in the Boston area, and we're looking up some of those stats. And within some of the reports, they show the number of firms experiencing these security breaches over the past year. It has increased, and we're looking at 3 in 10 of these firms talked about a security incident and the increase from the last year. We saw an increase across the board in 2020 because these criminals are extremely opportunistic, and if they find any sort of vulnerability or any sort of chaos, believe me, they're going to really go after that. We saw emails coming out really at the very beginning of the pandemic, looking like they came from the World Health Organization, the CDC. Hey, you have any of these symptoms? Click here. Click here for cases in your area. They're very opportunistic. During hurricane season, believe me, they go after the southeast very hard, knowing that people are working remotely and they have their guards down and they're putting out a lot of other fires. The way that they're getting through really hasn't changed as much as you might think. The phishing emails still are king. And they're not, they've gotten really good. I'm sure everybody has seen these really good phishing emails that look like every other email in your inbox. And, at this point, in order to survive, we all have to give a lot of information freely out on social media, LinkedIn, on your website, on Facebook pages. And so criminals can get access to a lot of information in only a matter of minutes to craft that email to make sure that it looks like every other email in your inbox. This goes back to people, processes, technology. Understanding how they're getting through is critical. And we talk about that multi-layered approach, the difference between just cybersecurity and cyber resiliency. When we looked at the businesses that were attacked, close to 6 of 10 have had anti-malware filtering in place. A lot of them had endpoint detection. Doesn't mean all of these things aren't critical. Yes, they have to be implemented, but it's part of a larger holistic approach to combating these threats. It goes back to the idea of this is not something you go buy off the shelf and say, hey, I just made an investment on some intrusion protection, I'm all set. It really needs to be one layer that continues to really be reviewed and put into a comprehensive cybersecurity plan, disaster recovery plan. And when we look at the impact of these attacks, I go back to that $18 million number. It is the loss of business productivity. When FEMA was looking at hurricane season, they had a stat that 40% of businesses of all shapes and sizes went out of business within 6 months after being down for a week or more. They were looking at obviously natural disasters, but downtime is downtime. And how long can you be down before it really starts to impact your office, your access to servicing your clients, potentially new clients, and really importantly, it hits your reputation. Only about a quarter of these attacks are actually reported to authorities. The reason being, one, unless it's $250,000 or more, the FBI is not going to really put much resources into it. They don't have the bandwidth to. The other reason, the more important reason, is that you don't want it to get out that you were the the firm that was attacked. So a lot of folks try to handle this without allowing it to get to the news. But it's always the loss of that business productivity. And I can remember presenting the stats from 2018 at various events saying, look, the average ransom payment's only $4,300 at the small business level. Not enough to break the bank. Look at the impact, it's 10 times higher. Look at where these numbers have gone. And these are for the smaller businesses. In North America, over a $300,000 impact. That number gets very quickly into the 7 figures. With that webinar that I did with that gentleman from the Houston office of the FBI, their number was about 1.6 million. They were looking at more of the mid-sized industry, but these are the numbers that we're talking about. And it's always going to be more expensive than paying the ransom. That's what the criminals want you to do. They want you to do this math. And gentlemen from the Department of Homeland Security that I did a panel with, they're very strict. If you've ever seen their presentations, they won't share their slides. They don't let you even take pictures of them. I don't understand why, because they're presenting this all publicly. But their number in terms of how long an average business is down from a ransomware attack before they're up into a real production environment, 16.2 days. Start to put that in perspective, and that's the average, about 16.2 days for anyone to get back up and running. Start to put that in perspective of where you are. And the reason why they're so successful, and the worst stat within this report, is that only 3 in 10 business owners are very concerned about ransomware moving into 2021. This is a number that shows the criminals they don't have to change anything that they're doing, because companies are not taking it seriously. They're not implementing true cyber resiliency plans and looking at their entire company. And you know, what's scary about this, 2019, that number was 41%. It's going in the wrong direction. I take it as almost a personal offense, Jim, that I do all these webinars and that number's going in the wrong direction. But we see good turnouts now on a lot of these webinars, and our job is really to turn that around, because that's really the way that we start to combat these folks. Now, very quickly, just about that pipeline attack, I mean, let's look at what that real impact was. It wasn't necessarily the risk of not ever getting the data back. Yes, they did pay $5 million, but what was the impact? They were down for over a week. I'm still paying up in Connecticut over $3 a gallon for gas. It was the cost of that downtime, and the idea that not only were they able to get through, but the pipeline didn't have a cyber resiliency plan to make sure that they can combat this and get up and running. And so when we look at these two things, you know, on the screen here, this is an important slide. It's trying to really explain what we're talking about in the cyber resiliency world. You've got the left-hand side of the screen. This is your recovery point objective. Everybody should be able to answer this right now. Essentially, how much data are you at risk of losing at a given time? How often are you taking these backups? Is it hourly? Is it daily? Every firm might have a different RPO goal, but you need to be able to answer that. And the caveat is, if you're not testing those backups, you really can't feel confident about that star. But ultimately, that's the first piece of leverage these criminals have. They steal your data, they encrypt your data. You know, do you have access to get that back? If you don't, then clearly you're going to pay or close your doors. But they do know most folks have some form of backup. It's really the right-hand side of the screen. This is an important piece to cover, the recovery time objective. How long would you be down? How resilient are you in order to get everybody in your office access to everything that they need? This is the big question. Can you answer this question? I know, Jim, you've got a recent story where you look at what that, you know, recovery can cost the business in terms of that, or how quickly you can get back up and running. So before we get into that, I'd like you to kind of share that story.
Yeah, so just thanks, Mike. At a really high level, what we had was we did have a firm where one of the attorneys clicked on a link that came in, something that they shouldn't have clicked on. And they did, in fact, have an incident where they started to have some encryption of data on the network. And our team detected what was going on. They were quickly able to stop the spread of the ransomware, but they did, in fact, have to restore data using the Datto Cirrus that was on the network. And the great thing about this is that it was actually a ransomware attack that occurred over the weekend, and they were able to restore all the data as if nothing had happened before the firm, before the attorneys and everybody else came back in on Monday. And it was great. The firm was newer to the Datto solution, and they knew that they were paying for it. They knew that they had it, but they'd never seen it in action. So it was great that we had the solution, you know, and as you said before, you can't prevent 100% of the attacks. You know, much larger firms, much larger businesses, the federal government, they've all had issues where one of those emails can get in and somebody in every organization is going to click on something. And to have the solution there and be able to roll everything back to the state it was in prior to the attack, that was really of value to the firm.
Yeah, and that shows the idea of this cyber resiliency piece and where that fits in. And luckily, there has been an evolution with backups in general, really that next iteration of business continuity of operations. That is really where, you know, it's become the industry standard. So to kind of talk about what that looks like, I think there's really 4 major pillars to what you need to think about in terms of your business continuity solution. First and foremost, you do want there to be multiple copies of your data in different geographical locations. You want that geo redundancy, because downtime, again, can occur from a lot of different reasons. Whether it's, an attack like this, whether it's a storm, a fire, something that happens to your office where that on-premise backup might be compromised. A lot of conversations that I have with folks, really businesses of all sizes, is that they do have a nice backup. It's just sitting in a server room in their office. And, you run the risk of that being compromised. So, with this, with where we are, we've got, I mentioned, the kind of breadth of what Datto does. We actually protect about an exabyte of data in our 9 data centers around the world. It's one of the largest private clouds in the world. And the idea here is that that data is going to stay in the country which it originates. So we've got 2 data centers here in the States. We've got one in Pennsylvania and one out in Utah. Again, the reason being they're on opposite sides of the country. You really want to make sure that, again, it goes back to that resiliency. Assume that something fails. What happens next? What happens next? All right, well, something happens to your server. It's great. You've got that on-premise backup. Let's look at a real disaster scenario. And that on-premise device is compromised. What happens next? Well, use another copy of your data in Pennsylvania, and then ultimately another copy of your data, out in Utah. And this is military-grade encryption in transit and at rest to what's called an immutable cloud, which means once that data is there, it cannot be changed. And so, there's not an impact of a ransomware attack getting up there as well. This is critical, knowing that you have the security of 3 separate full copies of that data. You do want to take automation into account. I think this has been the industry trend, but it's important to reiterate, 91% of data loss and downtime occurs because of human error. So understand how those backups are being taken, but also who's in charge of those, who's testing those backups. I go back to that RPO piece. You look at, okay, how often do I need to take those backups? Let's just say it's hourly, right? During business hours. Okay, here you go. Those are all going to be going along automatically, but they're also tested. Every single one of them is tested both locally and to ensure that offsite sync occurred. And so that those backups are all valid. Now maybe there's an X on one of those and there was a backup failure. At least now you can be proactive. An alert will be triggered. So you don't find out that, hey, our backups have been failing for 3 weeks, and now all of a sudden that RPO star jumped from 1 hour to 3 weeks. Gives you the ability, or gives Jim and his team the ability and the insights to go in there and take care of that. Now, I think it's important to understand the way in which this has shifted from traditional kind of commoditized file and folder level backup to real intelligent business continuity. And that's the way in which the backups are taken. It's not looked at as we're going to back up these files and folders. It is a full image of that server, of that critical workstation. So it's capturing, yes, all the volumes, all the files and folders, but also the operating system, the applications. Like everything that's on that server is now mirrored over to an on-premise device and then subsequently sent off. And what that allows us to do is a couple of different things. You're going to set up that schedule. And what's happening is once that full base image, which can be several terabytes of data, dozens of terabytes of data if need be, once that first full backup is taken, it's then seeded on a round trip drive out to the data centers. Once you set up that schedule, they're not full backups being taken. It's just incremental block level changes that are occurring between those 2 points in time. So it's not a ton of data that needs to be sent up to the cloud. But what it allows us to do is create what's called an inverse chain. So when you look at all those backup points, they are all independent of one another, because you'll read stories of criminals not only going after the servers, but after the backups as well, because they know that's the leverage they have. With this, there's no risk of previous backups being impacted. It also gives you the ability to detect ransomware in the way of not necessarily looking at individual variants, because it's very hard to keep up with the millions of them that are out there, but instead the footprint that it leaves. So every ransomware attack, as these backups are going along, they all look relatively similar. All of a sudden, every single file and folder changes in between these 2 data points. It's going to throw up an alert. It's going to send out a red flag saying, hey, this has the footprint, this has the look of every other ransomware attack we've seen, and oh, here's the last clean backup. Again, going back to that cyber resiliency, trying to detect it as quickly as possible. But the scenario that Jim had mentioned, it really goes into the idea of continuity of operations, that virtualization piece. And what this would look like, and it's really a mindset shift if you're not using business continuity right now, is that, all right, we've got this backup point where we could take a look at it, right? It's we get attacked at 11 o'clock. Let's roll back to the 10 o'clock. What this would allow you to do is, okay, Bill down the hall clicks on an email, gets the scary red screen, and now that server is now impacted. It gives you the ability to call up Jim and his team, and they would spin up what's called a virtual machine right from this device, a virtual instance right from this device. And so everybody that in the firm that had access to that server now is operating off of this. This is operating as your server. And so again, that first reaction isn't to be, oh, we got to start our restoration, which can take days or weeks or that 16.2 days. No, we're looking at hours to get these up and running. Depending on your data set, it could be even faster than that. I used to do some fun things back on the road and do disaster demos, and Jim's seen a million of them where, we'll do a presentation, smash a laptop, and then spin up a virtualization of that device, and you could do it in a data set that size, 20 seconds, you're up and running. But what this really means is that you're now reducing that downtime to hours instead of days or weeks, taking away that leverage from them. And you could be in this virtualized state for several hours, days, weeks, because there's active backups being taken while you're in this state as well. And so now when you get a new piece of hardware in place and you're ready to get that data back, you're getting yourself back to a point in time, not in which Bill down the hall clicked on that email he wasn't supposed to, but instead where you were the moment that that new piece of hardware is in place. And so you're reducing the downtime on the front end and on the back end as well. And you have the ability to do this locally or from either one of those data centers. So, we're up here in Connecticut, right on Long Island Sound. Another Hurricane Sandy comes up here. When Hurricane Sandy occurred, there were thousands of businesses operating out of our data center while their server rooms were being drained out, new racks were being put in. How many of those businesses would have been able to survive and wouldn't have fallen victim to that 40% number that FEMA had put out if they didn't have access to something like this? So this is that continuity of operations. This is how you combat those threats. And I'll leave this before we open it up to Q&A with the idea that businesses are changing. The way that we're doing business is changing. That acceleration of 10 years in a matter of 10 months is real. And we started to adopt a lot of different online collaboration tools. You saw this huge spike in Microsoft Teams, G Suite, these other types of products. And it really allows us to operate. Nobody calls my cell phone anymore. They say, let's jump on a Zoom meeting, let's jump on a Teams meeting. Even though we're moving back into this somewhat sense of normalcy where either you're back in the office or in a hybrid scenario, this way of communication, in my opinion, is here to stay. And so the criminals understand this. And within that report, we found that about a quarter of the managed service providers that we talked to had clients who were attacked with their software as a service applications. The majority of those were Microsoft 365. We saw it with Dropbox, we saw it with Google Workplace. The criminals will follow that. Again, it goes back to how opportunistic they are. And you could follow this in the news. You can see the statistics. Yes, there's this huge boom, and if you bought stock, you're doing very well because everybody adapted to this work from anywhere environment. The criminals followed. The thought process of the criminals are only attacking on-premise Windows-based servers is really changing. Yes, most of the attacks still occur there because most of the data still lives there. As it moves and migrates to different places, you have to understand that it still needs to be protected because, again, it comes back to your people. The vast majority of attacks are human error, not necessarily someone malicious, but somebody not being educated. And the reason why this is important is because both of the big players in this, Microsoft and G Suite, they have what's called the shared responsibility model, meaning that they're going to protect the integrity of their data center, of their cloud. And so think about brute force attacks. But you, as the tenant, if you're using one of these products, you provide the security in their cloud, meaning if you go and delete data, they're not going to say that they're liable for that. It'll sit, hopefully, in your trash box for 30 days, but they're not going to guarantee any of that. It's right in their SLA, it's in their forms. They actually endorse not a particular product, but the idea of backing up your data in a third-party way. And I think it's very important. In G Suite, essentially the same language. Think about it also of somebody leaving the firm. What happens to all the data that they have? Are you going to continue to pay for that license, or do you have the ability to just have that backup sitting in a folder somewhere where folks can access that years from now? And so that's extremely important. And I'll leave you with this, another little cool story if you haven't heard of it. This gentleman by the name of Kevin Mitnick, at one point in the 90s, he was on the FBI's most wanted list. He was the most notorious hacker in the world, and he was caught. Very high profile arrest, went to jail, he came out, now he's what's called an ethical hacker. He works with the good guys, kind of like Catch Me If You Can. We had hired him to come to our DattoCon kind of global conference back in June of 2019. And he created a live virus that he termed Ransom Cloud. And so this wasn't a theoretical, this is what might happen, here's a click through of what a criminal might do. No, this is a real life hacker saying, if I was still out there, this is what I would be doing. And he thought of this before the huge wave that occurred last year. And it was very simple. He stood on stage with 2 laptops and said, okay, take a look at this email. Would you open this email? Looks legitimate. Anti-spam pro, you sit through a webinar like this, oh my goodness, I have to be protected. Maybe this is the first email you see in your inbox in the morning. You've got a meeting at 8 o'clock. Let me just do this really fast so it doesn't, auto update or whatever I need to do. Let me click on this. All right, all I got to do is click on this accept button, get on the way here. Once you accept that, well, all of a sudden all your emails are encrypted. And oh, by the way, if you're a firm that just grants admin access to everybody, which surprisingly happens all the time, this can now migrate to the entire domain. And so the only email you can open is, here's that pretty red screen again, this time from Kevin saying, hey, I'll go ahead and unencrypt your emails if you pay me some ransom, again, in Bitcoin. It shows you the ease of which, and I think what's important to note, this was June of 2019 that I saw a live demo that encrypted, an inbox within a matter of 20 seconds. Think about the evolution of where they've gone on the criminal side of things. They're going to file that data, and they're going to find ways to do it. I think the idea here is take a step back, take an inventory of where all your data lives, where all your physical devices live first, but then where all your data lives, whether it's in the cloud somewhere, who has access to that data? Does everybody have access to what they need? Check that off, but do they only have access to the data that they need? Because you don't want them having access to everything because it can now migrate everywhere. And do an inventory of that. Say, how is it being protected on the front end? But do we have a second copy of that somewhere? So that kind of gives you a sense of the landscape. We'll open it up to questions. And, Jim, if you want to chime in and add some thoughts as we wait for those questions to come in.
Yeah, Mike, and actually I did type a question. I put it in the box in the chat. I think that it might be helpful for some of the attendees to get an understanding of how safe is their firm's data when it's stored in the Datto data centers, the Datto cloud. Because obviously, a lot of firms were of the mindset that they were building out their own data centers where they were in complete control of their data. So it's a little bit of a shift when the data is now leaving their network and going into Datto. So can you talk a little bit about the security and the steps that are taken to protect that data?
Yeah, absolutely. So I mentioned briefly earlier, we don't use third-party data centers at all. We control all of these data centers, and it's actually over an exabyte of data. I'm going to Google that. It's we'll see. You'll be surprised how big that is. But what happens is once that data leaves the on-premise device, it is automatically military-grade encrypted, 256-bit encrypted to the data center in transit and at rest. And once it's there, I mentioned the immutable cloud system. Essentially, once that data is there, it cannot be modified. It cannot be encrypted once it's there. And then we've got multiple layers of that secondary data center as well. And so it really takes that leverage out. You're going to have those safe copies of your data, and that inverse chain comes into play as well because all of those data points are independent of one another. So the security is the question I get all the time. How do you know that data up in the cloud is not going to be encrypted? Well, that's the reason why. The encryption on the way up there, and then the fact that the data itself is in an immutable cloud allows us to make sure that doesn't occur.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so I believe that we don't have anybody else asking any questions. Excuse me. I guess one thing I'm going to ask you sort of a softball question just because I'm pretty familiar with the Datto system. Could we talk a little bit about, for the IT folks that are listening in on this call, how do they know it's working? When Datto is in place and it's protecting the data, how are they going to know that their data is safe, that they've got good backups?
Yeah, we've got a couple patents on that because that's really the most important piece, right? A backup is only as good as how valid it is and the speed in which you can recover it. So I showed that quick screen about how each backup is being tested, but we also have what's called screenshot verification, which means that is testing the virtualization capabilities of that data. And that happens every single night. It's brought all the way up to a boot screen, and there is a snapshot taken. You can see the timestamp on it. And that is, continues to be advanced in terms of what that is looking for, and to make sure that data is not only bootable, that the data is valid there. And so that's critical. I think it's important to note that that's all happening on an automated basis. If there is any issue with it, an alert is triggered for that. But that is one of the most important pieces that you need to answer. Again, is that data accessible? Is it there? And then, how quickly can I get it back? And so those are all being tested locally to make sure that offsite sync occurred, and then that virtualization capability is there. And if you wanted to take it one step further, you can do a full-blown disaster recovery test in our data centers. You'd schedule that, and it would actually see what a cloud virtualization would look like. So that's, the forefront of what we're trying to do is not just back up the data and make sure it's there, but continuously test that to give the reassurance that all those things are happening and going along with pretty green dots next to them to make sure it's working.
Okay, great. Yeah, I think that is a great feature. Okay, a question has been submitted. What's one tip I can give to my employees today to help protect our data?
You want me to take a stab at that one, and then maybe you could chime in?
Yeah, I'd love to hear your take on that.
Yeah, I mean, if you were to take one takeaway of what we're talking about here, in terms of at the employee level, it's that education piece. It really is that education. If you start doing regular kind of trainings or fake phishing attacks, which is something everybody should be doing, you're going to see the amount of clicks drop precipitously. And I think, just relying on the technology is only one phase of those three kind of phases that we talked about. So it really is as simple as your people as your first starting point. And then as you move into, a kind of company-wide idea, it's putting this pen to paper or, keys to a keyboard of what this holistic cyber resiliency plan looks like. Document it, make sure that everybody reviews it and understands it, because as an attack occurs, everybody needs to know what they need to do, isolate that machine, who do they need to call if they make a mistake, and then have those conversations and continuously update that and address those. Is that kind of what you recommend as a first step?
Yeah, I agree, and that was a great answer, especially as it goes to the employees within an organization. I'm going to go a little bit further and talk about tips for the IT side of the house, the people that are responsible for this technology, because I think that's something that we've seen over the past couple of years is that it's not always an end user who's clicking on that link to let the ransomware in. I think that there have been several notable attacks that were caused by unpatched systems or improperly or inadequately secured systems. And whether that's Microsoft Office 365 accounts that are not protected with multi-factor authentication, or RDP or terminal servers that are not, don't have multi-factor, or that they're not protected through some sort of VPN or even filtering, geo-filtering to prevent access from outside of the US, or blocking unauthorized IP addresses from attempting to access these servers. Because I think what we've seen is some of these RDP servers that the hackers, and I'm not the biggest security guy myself, but I understand that there have been attacks on RDP and terminal servers where they didn't even need to have a valid set of credentials to get into that RDP session and gain access and encrypt those systems. So I think that the smaller businesses, even the mid-sized firms, if they're not taking a serious look about how better to secure their mail systems or their remote access servers, that they're going to be basically asking for these attacks. And while there used to be this theory that my firm is too small, nobody's interested in what I'm doing, now it's a matter of somebody running a script to find out what kind of servers and what ports are open on your network and just attacking it, regardless of who you are or whether or not they think that you have the finances or interesting data. It's just a script that can indiscriminately go out and attack. And I think that that's something that the IT industry, that people that are working in these roles really need to take a look at. And I believe that some of these notable hacks recently may have had to do with unpatched servers. And I don't know if you know about that, Mike, but the Colonial Pipeline, I did hear that there were unpatched servers and remote employees and not having the system appropriately locked down. Now, I think that's what I heard about it. I haven't seen a formal write-up on it stating that, but just, in the circles that I travel, and this is the kind of things that we talk about over drinks, and I'm pretty sure that's what I heard about Colonial.
Yeah, and I heard the same thing. And then even if you go back a little further, the WannaCry attack back in 2017, they were exploiting folks not, with patching updates. And that was at the time the largest, in terms of size and scope, the largest ransomware attack ever pulled. It was 220,000 networks in a single day. So when you talk about opportunistic, that's again some things they're looking at. That people aren't doing the simple stuff, and they can just pick off the low-hanging fruit.
Yeah, that's great. All right, let's see.
So I do think we have a question I think maybe you can address, Jim.
Sure.
There's a local BitLocker application to a node to counter a hacker's attempt at encryption of your data.
Wait, say that one more time for me.
Yes. So there's a local BitLocker application to a node counter a hacker's attempt at encryption of your data. Is this one of the ways that we can, I guess, kind of prevent some of those?
Yeah, so that's going to be a little bit above my pay grade at this point, Mike.
Yep, I'm in the same boat as you. Yeah, I think those are one of those things you got to have a conversation about, and it's really where I would leave as the next step. Is to have somebody like have Jim come in there or somebody from his team and do an assessment and a gap analysis, see what you have, get an engineer in there to take a look at things. It's extremely critical, especially right now as we're in this transition period. This is the time to do that. And then questions like that, on an individual one-off basis, I think really go a long way. And that's, again, goes back to this is not a product you buy off the shelf, right? This is a holistic approach, and that would be one layer of that.
Yeah, and I'm looking at this question right now. Does a local BitLocker application to a node counter a hacker's attempt at encryption of your data? Yeah, what I think I would agree. That's a question right there where I can see that Ernesto is on this webinar. He's listening in. So what I think I'm going to do is I'm going to punt that question to Ernesto to follow up offline, as he is one of our security engineers. We'll do a follow up on that. All right. Looks like, see another question here if I can get to. Mike, can you pull up this next question that just came in?
Oh, yeah. So does Datto have penetration testing scheduled by a third party? Yeah, so we expanded our security team a few years ago. We've obviously had a big investment in that. But what our CISO has done is really created a whole task force of this. So that is something that is constantly being monitored. And we were really first to market with some of these type of security measures that we've made mandatory internally, but both with our partners that we work with, because we don't sell direct at all. We only sell through managed service providers. So it's important to us not only to do these regularly on our systems, but to make sure that even our partners that we work with adhere to those same security measures. Great question.
I agree. Okay, that's the last of the questions that I see submitted there. So what's next, Mike?
Again, I think the next step would be to reach out to folks from your team and doing a little bit of an assessment of what you have. Worst case scenario, you get a bunch of checkboxes and say, yes, this cyber resiliency plan is perfect. But getting that third party validation is critical. Yeah, I think I'm a big believer in that. I know you are too, Jim. Even with existing clients, consistently reviewing those is critical, because what might have worked 5 years ago probably needs to be advanced now. So it's something that needs to be reviewed. I guess I'll leave it to you as to what we've got a great list of attendants here. What their next step should be.
Right. Okay, well, yeah, I think that's it. So for all the attendees that have attended, your account managers may follow up with you just to get some feedback on the webinar, or whether or not you found this educational and helpful. If there are further questions, if somebody comes up with a question after we end the webinar, you can reach out to your sales executive or your account manager or your VCIO if you're currently working with Frontline to get more information. Mike, I feel like you and I have seen a lot of each other lately. So if anybody has any questions for Mike, to dig a little bit deeper, I can easily bring Mike back into the conversation. He's very knowledgeable about these topics. I think that's it. And we will, for anybody who came in a little bit late, we will be sending out a link for the webinar, which has been recorded. And that's all I got, Mike.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for including us. Everybody stay safe. Enjoy the rest of your day.
All right, Mike, thank you very much. I appreciate your time.
You got it, Jim. Thanks.
And thank you.